Right now, China is quietly taking control of the world's ports, and most people have no idea it's happening. Over the last 25 years, Chinese state-backed companies have poured nearly $24 billion into port infrastructure across 90 countries. That's nearly half the entire United Nations. You heard that right. And because over 80% of global trade moves by sea, that means one country is steadily wrapping its hands around the system that moves almost everything you buy, sell, and depend on. It started with a broke European port and a deal nobody saw coming, the machine behind it. To understand how this is happening, you need to know who's actually doing it. Because this isn't being driven by private investors chasing quarterly profits. This is being orchestrated by two of the most powerful state-backed companies most people have never heard of, COSCO Shipping and China Merchants Group. COSCO was founded in 1961 as a government shipping agency. Its first vessel was a second-hand British ship that sailed from Guangzhou to Jakarta. That was the humble beginning. Over the next 6 decades, that single ship became a fleet of more than 1,300 vessels, operating across over 160 countries. And in 2016, the Chinese State Council merged COSCO with China Shipping Group to create the largest shipping conglomerate on the planet, not a private company. A state-owned enterprise, supervised directly by the Chinese government. Then there's China Merchants Group, which is even older. It was founded in 1872 during the Qing dynasty as China's first modern merchant shipping company. Today, it operates across 46 ports in 26 countries and handles nearly 146 million containers a year. Together, COSCO and China Merchants control roughly a quarter of all container throughput handled by ports globally. Let that satisfyingly terrifying number sit with you for a moment. But here's what makes this fundamentally different from any private shipping company expanding its business. Both of these entities answer directly to Beijing. Their boards are filled with government-appointed officials. Their strategies are aligned with national policy. And in 2013, that national policy got a name, the Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI was China's master blueprint for building infrastructure across the developing world and beyond roads, railways, pipelines, and above all, ports. The logic was breathtakingly simple. Finance the construction, bring in Chinese firms to build it, and secure long-term operational control in return. It wasn't aid, it wasn't charity. It was a system designed to embed China into the physical infrastructure of global trade. And nowhere did that system work more dramatically than on the southern tip of Europe, the European foothold. In 2008, Greece was falling apart. The debt crisis had gutted the economy, unemployment was surging, and the country was being forced to sell off state assets just to stay afloat. One of those assets was the port of Piraeus, the largest port in Greece, and one of the most strategically positioned in all of Europe. It sits right at the mouth of the Mediterranean, directly on the route that connects the Suez Canal to the heart of the continent. And at the time, it was a mess. Ships were piling up, workers were on strike, and the port's container traffic had collapsed from 1.5 million units down to just 450,000. That's when COSCO walked in. While Western companies were running away from Greece, China moved in the opposite direction. COSCO secured a 35-year lease to operate 2 of the port's 3 container terminals. And then it got to work. Within just a few years, container volume didn't just recover, it exploded. By 2015, throughput had climbed past 3 million units. By 2016, COSCO bought a 51% controlling stake in the Piraeus Port Authority for roughly 370 million euros and later raised that to 67%. No European company had even submitted a competing bid. Today, Piraeus is the 4th largest container port in all of Europe and the busiest in the Mediterranean. China didn't just save this port. It turned it into the front door of its entire European logistics strategy, what officials in Beijing openly call the dragon's head of the Belt and Road in Europe. But Piraeus was only the beginning. Because while that deal grabbed headlines, China was quietly securing stakes in the ports that actually run the continent's trade. In Rotterdam, Europe's largest port, COSCO, holds a 35% stake in the Euromax terminal, one of the most advanced automated container facilities in the world. In Antwerp-Bruges, Europe's second-largest COSCO owns a 20% stake in Antwerp Gateway and holds full control of the container terminal in Zeebrugge. Add in stakes in Hamburg, Valencia, and Bilbao, and Chinese companies now have interests in nearly 30 terminals across the European Union, including 20 of the continent's top 15 ports. Think about that. China didn't need to own Europe's ports outright. It just needed a seat at the table, in the ones that matter most, and now it has exactly that. But Europe was just one piece of the puzzle. The real strategic prize was always the Indian Ocean, the most heavily trafficked waterway on Earth, the South Asian corridor. If Europe was the front door, then South Asia is the engine room. Because the Indian Ocean isn't just another body of water, it's the highway that connects the oil fields of the Middle East to the factories of East Asia. And China has been quietly locking down ports on both sides of it. Start with Gwadar, on the southwestern tip of Pakistan. This deep-water port sits on the Arabian Sea, less than 110 miles from Iran's coast, and just a short distance from the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil passes every single day. China's state-owned China Overseas Port Holding Company secured a 43-year lease to operate Gwadar, retaining over 90% of port revenue. But Gwadar isn't just a port. It's the starting point of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a nearly 2,000-mile network of highways, railways, and pipelines that connects directly to Western China. If completed as planned, this corridor gives China a direct overland shortcut to the Arabian Sea, completely bypassing the Strait of Malacca, the narrow waterway in Southeast Asia that China has long viewed as its most dangerous vulnerability. Then came Sri Lanka and the deal that became the most talked about cautionary tale in modern infrastructure finance. Sri Lanka wanted a major deep-water port in Hambantota, a small town on its southern coast sitting within 10 nautical miles of one of the busiest shipping lanes on the planet. India and the United States were approached for financing. Neither offered terms Sri Lanka accepted. China did through its Export-Import Bank, with over $1 billion in loans. The port was built, but it struggled commercially. Traffic fell far below projections. And in 2017, a 70% controlling stake in Hambantota was leased to China Merchants Port for 99 years in exchange for $1.12 billion. Whether you call it a debt trap or a strategic lease, the result is the same. China now operates a port on one of the world's most critical shipping corridors for the next century. And then there's Colombo, Sri Lanka's primary port, where China Merchants holds a controlling stake in the Colombo International Container Terminal. Unlike Hambantota, Colombo is no underperformer. It's the busiest transshipment hub in South Asia, handling the majority of the region's container traffic. China didn't wait for a crisis here. It invested early and secured its position at the heart of South Asian trade. Now put these three ports on a map. Gwadar anchors the western flank on the Arabian Sea. Hambantota locks down the southern Indian Ocean shipping lane, and Colombo commands the region's busiest commercial hub. Together, they form a corridor connecting China's western interior through Pakistan to the sea and stretching across the Indian Ocean toward Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. But China wasn't done with the Indian Ocean. Not even close, because the next piece of this network was being built on the other side in Africa. The African Anchor Africa is where China's port strategy shifts from investment into something that looks a lot more like infrastructure dominance. China went from involvement in 2 African ports in 2000 to more than 70 facilities across 30 countries by the early 2020s, and 3 projects tell you everything you need to know. Start with Djibouti, a country smaller than the state of New Jersey, but arguably one of the most strategically important pieces of land on Earth. It sits right on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow choke point where the Red Sea meets the Gulf of Aden. Roughly 12 to 20% of all global trade flows through this corridor every year. China Merchants Group holds a stake in the port operations there. But here's what most people miss. In 2017, just minutes from the commercial port, China opened its first overseas military base, a heavily fortified facility with a pier long enough to dock aircraft carriers. Positioned just 7 miles from America's only permanent military base in Africa, you're not looking at a commercial investment anymore. You're looking at a dual-use foothold at one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. Then there's the most devastating economic move. China financed and built the standard gauge railway connecting Kenya's port of Mombasa to Nairobi, a project costing roughly $3.6 billion, funded almost entirely by Chinese loans. Reports emerged that the port itself may have been pledged as collateral. The Kenyan government denies it, but the structural dependency speaks for itself. China built the infrastructure, financed the railway, feeding it, and holds the loans, keeping it all running. And then came Lekki, Nigeria's first fully automated deepwater port, built by China Harbor Engineering Company at a cost of roughly $1.5 billion. It sits about 40 miles east of Lagos, serving West Africa's largest economy. The port began commercial operations in 2023, handling over 1 million containers a year. Countries across the region, Chad, Niger, Mali, Cameroon, have already signaled interest in routing their trade through Lekki. This isn't just a Nigerian port. It's being positioned as the gateway for an entire region. Zoom out and the pattern is undeniable. Djibouti controls the Red Sea choke point. Mombasa anchors East Africa's trade corridor. Lekki is becoming the commercial nerve center of the West. China isn't building isolated ports in Africa. It's constructing port-to-rail-to-corridor systems that connect mines, factories, and entire economies back to Beijing. And yet, Africa wasn't the final frontier. Because China's most audacious port project, the one that caught the entire Western Hemisphere off guard, was just getting started on the other side of the world. The Latin American play. For decades, South America's trade with Asia had to take the long way around, routing through ports in Central America or the United States before crossing the Pacific. That meant higher costs, longer transit times, and a dependence on logistics networks that China had no control over. Chancay changed everything. In November 2024, COSCO officially opened the port of Chancay in Peru, a $3.5 billion megaport about 50 miles north of Lima. This is not some modest shipping terminal. Chancay is South America's first smart and green port, equipped with fully automated loading systems, Huawei 5G connectivity, electric container trucks, and berths deep enough to accommodate the largest container ships on the planet. It can handle over 1 million containers a year in its first phase alone, with plans to scale to 15 berths and 1.5 million units. COSCO holds a 60% controlling stake. But the engineering isn't even the most important part. What makes Chancay a game changer is what it does to the map. A direct shipping route now connects Chancay to Shanghai in just 23 days, slashing nearly 2 weeks off the previous transit time. That means South American exports copper, zinc, lithium, soybeans, fresh fruit can now flow directly to China without touching a single American port. You heard that right. China has built a trade corridor between South America and Asia that bypasses the United States entirely, and it doesn't stop at the Pacific coast. Brazil, the region's agricultural powerhouse, is already in talks with China over the construction of a transcontinental railway that would link Chancay to Brazil's Atlantic coast. If that railway is built, it would create a land bridge across South America, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through Chinese-financed infrastructure. That's not a port. That's the foundation of an entirely new trade corridor for an entire continent. Chancay is the clearest signal yet that China isn't just investing where the trade already flows. It's building new routes and placing itself at the center of every one of them. And once you understand how all these ports connect, the scale of what China has engineered becomes impossible to ignore. That's 6 more than the original 19 total 3,700. Here are sections 7 through 10. The engineering and financial scale. Now that you've seen where China is building, you need to understand how it's paying for all of it, because the financial model is just as strategic as the geography. The money behind these ports doesn't come from private equity firms or commercial banks chasing short-term returns. It flows from 2 massive state policy banks, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. Together, these 2 institutions have pumped out hundreds of billions of dollars in overseas infrastructure loans, dwarfing the combined export financing of the entire G7. The Exim Bank alone has over $289 billion in outstanding Belt and Road loans spread across more than 130 countries. To put that in perspective, that is more overseas development lending than the World Bank provided over the same period. And these aren't banks that answer to shareholders or quarterly targets. They answer directly to the Chinese state, and their mandate isn't profit maximization, it's long-term strategic projection. And the terms of these loans are designed to do something very specific: China finances the construction. Chinese state-owned firms build the port. Chinese companies supply the cranes, the automation systems, the port management software, and even the 5G connectivity that runs the whole operation. And in return, China secures long-term operational control, often through leases and concessions that stretch 40, 50, even 99 years. The host country gets a world-class port it couldn't otherwise afford to build on its own. China gets a permanent seat inside that country's trade infrastructure for generations. It's a closed loop, and every single piece of it feeds back to Beijing. But here's what makes the system truly unlike anything the West has ever attempted overseas. These ports aren't standalone projects. Each one is deliberately connected to something larger: a railway, a pipeline, a special economic zone, an industrial corridor. Gwadar connects to a 2,000-mile highway and rail corridor stretching deep into western China. Mombasa connects to a Chinese-built standard-gauge railway running into Nairobi and the East African interior. Lekki sits inside a 30-square-kilometer Chinese-developed free trade zone with its own dedicated logistics infrastructure. Chancay is linked by a 1.1-mile tunnel to Peru's Pan-American Highway, with active discussions underway for a transcontinental rail connection to Brazil's Atlantic coast. The port is never the endpoint. It's the node, and the corridor is the system. This is what separates China's approach from every infrastructure investment model that came before it. China isn't building individual ports. It's building fully integrated logistics ecosystems, and each new ecosystem makes the next one more valuable, more connected, and more difficult to replace. And when you map those ecosystems onto the world's most important shipping lanes, the strategic picture comes into devastating focus. The strategic map: take a globe and trace the routes that carry over 80% of the world's trade by sea. Start in the South China Sea, move through the Strait of Malacca, cross the Indian Ocean, push up through the Bab el-Mandeb into the Red Sea, pass through the Suez Canal, and enter the Mediterranean. Then branch south along the East African coast. Then sweep west across the Atlantic to the shores of South America. Now place every single port you've heard about in this script on that map, and look at what emerges. Piraeus sits at the Mediterranean end of the Suez route, Europe's front door for goods arriving from Asia. Djibouti guards the Bab el-Mandeb, the choke point between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, where up to 20% of global trade squeezes through a corridor barely 18 miles wide. Gwadar flanks the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil flows every single day. Hambantota and Colombo straddle the central Indian Ocean shipping lane, the critical artery connecting the oil fields of the Middle East to the manufacturing powerhouses of East Asia. Mombasa anchors the East African trade corridor, and Chancay opens a brand new Pacific route connecting South America directly to Shanghai, cutting out the old transit paths that once ran through North American ports entirely. Here's the strategic logic that ties every single one of these investments together. You don't need to control a strait if you control the ports on either side of it. And right now, China has positioned itself at nearly every critical juncture where global trade passes through. This isn't scattered investment. This isn't opportunistic deal-making. This is a deliberate map, drawn port by port, lease by lease, loan by loan, designed to give one country quiet but undeniable influence over how the entire world moves its goods. And that influence is exactly what makes this whole operation so much bigger than shipping. Leverage, not ownership. Here's what you need to understand about what China has actually built. It doesn't need to own global trade. It just needs to be indispensable to it. When you operate a port terminal, you gain access to something most people never think about: data. You see what's being shipped, where it's going, how much it weighs, what it costs, and exactly when it moves. You influence scheduling, logistics pricing, and capacity allocation. You don't need to block a single shipment to have leverage over a country's economy. You just need to be the one that everyone depends on to keep those shipments moving smoothly and on time. And once that dependency is established, it doesn't go away. It deepens. And that's precisely the position China has engineered for itself over the last 2 decades. Long-term leases that outlast political cycles create structural dependencies that no single election can undo. Think about the timeline you've just walked through. A 43-year lease in Pakistan, a 99-year lease in Sri Lanka, a 45-year concession in Nigeria, a 35-year operating agreement in Greece. These aren't ordinary business deals. They're generational commitments that lock host countries into Chinese logistics networks for decades to come. And the network effect compounds the lock-in with every new port. The more facilities that plug into China's system, the more expensive it becomes for any individual country to opt out. Every new connection raises the cost of disconnecting from the whole. This is not how power was projected in the past. The British East India Company used military force to control trade routes. The Americans built military bases around the world to project strength across oceans. China is doing something fundamentally different, and in many ways, something far more durable. It's building commercial infrastructure that countries genuinely want and actively request, that their economies come to depend on year after year, and that quietly shifts the balance of global trade leverage toward Beijing, with every container that crosses a Chinese-operated dock, not through military threats, not through political coercion, through concrete, cranes, and capital. And that may be the most important thing to understand about everything you've just heard, the world's new operating system. So here's where all of this leaves you. Every container of electronics you order, every barrel of oil your country imports, every shipment of grain that crosses an ocean at some point along its journey, it very likely passes through a port that China has financed, built, or operates. From the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, from the Red Sea to the Pacific coast of South America, the physical infrastructure that moves the global economy now runs through Chinese hands. Not partially, not theoretically, functionally. This didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen overnight. It happened through more than 60 years of patient compounding strategy, from a single second-hand British ship sailing out of Guangzhou in 1961 to a sprawling network of ports, railways, and industrial corridors spanning 90 countries across every inhabited continent on Earth. China didn't conquer territory. It didn't send warships or fighter jets. It sent engineers, bankers, and construction crews. And while the rest of the world was focused on elections and quarterly earnings and 24-hour news cycles, China was pouring foundations, signing leases, and laying rail one port at a time, one country at a time, one corridor at a time, until the network became too large, too embedded, and too critical to untangle. What you are looking at isn't a collection of disconnected port investments. It isn't foreign aid, and it certainly isn't charity. It is the single most ambitious infrastructure play in modern history, a global logistics network designed, financed, and operated by one country to ensure that no matter where goods move on this planet, China is somewhere along the route, quietly embedded in the flow. China didn't just invest in ports, it built the operating system for how the world moves goods. And right now, whether the rest of the world was paying close attention or not, that system is already up and running across the globe.